Good morning. Welcome to the third meeting of the committee in 2014. Can I ask everyone to ensure they've switched off their mobile phones and other electronic equipment, please? Our first item of business today is an oral evidence session on the draft third National Planning Framework and review of the Scottish planning policy. Along with our scrutiny, three other committees are also examining the draft framework as it is relevant to their remit also. Therefore, we will focus our scrutiny on the framework's strategic relationship with Scottish planning policy and examine how both these documents support the other key Scottish Government policies. We will also take this opportunity to question the Minister for Local Government and Planning on the planning-related issues which have arisen during the course of our inquiry work over the last 12 months. So, can I welcome our first panel this morning, Derek Mackay, MSP, Minister for Local Government and Planning, John McNerney, the Chief Planner, Scottish Government, Fiona Simpson, the Assistant Chief Planner, Scottish Government, and Helen Wood, the Principal Planner for the Scottish Government. Welcome and good morning to you all. Minister, would you like to make some opening remarks?
Thank you, Convener. The proposed National Planning Framework 3 is a spatial expression of the Government's economic strategy. It is about our ambition to create high-quality places that support sustainable economic growth across the country, realising our opportunities for development and investment. It brings together our plans and strategies to provide a coherent vision of how Scotland as a place should evolve over the next 20 to 30 years. From the beginning of the process, I have been clear that I want the National Planning Framework and the Scottish Planning Policy to focus on planning for economic recovery, a transition to low-carbon economy and sustainable economic growth. The spatial strategy set out in NPF 3 aims to achieve balanced and sustainable growth across Scotland. It plays to our strengths, highlighting, for example, the role of the city regions and towns in continuing to attract investment, and it highlights where planning can help to reduce disadvantage. The vision for our future development describes Scotland as a successful, sustainable place, a low-carbon place, a natural and resilient place and a connected place. But it is much more than just a vision. The National Planning Framework will be taken forward by development plans and decisions on individual planning applications as they make a real difference to our places and communities. To help guide this, the proposed NPF 3 explains what the strategy means for cities and the regions, towns, rural areas, our coast and islands. The proposed NPF 3 identifies 14 national developments which build on opportunities and will help us deliver our national strategy. National development status does not automatically grant planning consent, of course. Robust planning and assessment will still be required as these projects come forward as development proposals. Neither does it imply a Scottish Government spending commitment. Instead, it provides greater certainty for investors and delivery partners by establishing the need for these developments and aims to streamline consenting processes as proposals come forward. The committee set out a number of issues that they wish to focus on their consideration in proposed NPF 3, and I would like to briefly highlight three of these issues and the responses to them. Firstly, the committee has questions about the relationship between NPF 3 and Scottish planning policy. In short, NPF 3 sets out broadly where there will be opportunities for development and growth in the coming years. It is complemented by Scottish planning policy, which explains more about how we expect planning authorities to address nationally important land use planning matters and deliver positive and sustainable change. The relationship between these two documents is crucial. This is the first time they've been reviewed together, and this has given us an excellent opportunity to define a clear vision and set out shared outcomes for the planning system as a whole. The committee is considering the preparation process, in particular the steps we've taken to involve people in developing NPF 3. We've undertaken extensive and innovative work to engage with people from the very earliest stages of the process, and in the early stages many people shared with us their vision for the future through participative mapping. We consulted widely on the main issues report and draft SPP and had lively debates and discussions with communities, business organisations and the Scottish planning profession throughout the process, and learning from Parliament's view on NPF 2, we took steps to ensure that the engagement went well beyond the usual suspects to involve a wider range of people, including individual members of the public. It is inevitable with the National Spatial Strategy that we will not be able to address everyone's point of view. We have to make choices and prioritise actions that we believe are in the national interest. We've worked hard to ensure that the proposed framework reflects many of the ideas that people have shared with us, and where there are competing views, I'm confident that we've achieved the right balance. Finally, the committee has also raised some questions about the role of NPF 3 in delivering wider policy objectives. A good spatial plan should make clear choices and provide direction. It cannot and should not prescribe every development that should take place in the future. It's an integrated, place-based and national strategy for future development, and look forward to discussing the role of spatial planning, delivering these wider policies and achieving better outcomes for the economy, environment and quality of life in Scotland as a whole. I welcome the opportunity to discuss planning matters, including MPF3 and the wider review of Scottish planning policy with the committee this morning.
Thank you very much, Minister. We've had MPF 1 and 2 and now we move on to 3. Can I ask if the Government has looked at the effectiveness of MPF 1 and MPF 2 and looked at the delivery of the aims in these documents before formulating MPF 3?
Of course, Convener, the monitoring arrangements for the previous national planning frameworks were reported upon. We didn't produce the report last year. Of course, we were then working on the main issues report for this, so it would have been unhelpful to do that. But clearly, as we progress from MPF 2 to MPF 3, we've studied the impact of certain policy priorities and in terms of the national developments. I'll give you a couple of examples. The Commonwealth Games in Glasgow was a project in MPF 2. It's not required for MPF 3 because it will be underway by the time this process is at its end. So it's a natural evolutionary process that national developments either continue where required, don't continue where the consent is no longer required for whatever reason or local circumstance. And then the wider policies are monitored through both the monitoring report and then in this document, the ongoing action plan.
Okay. Can I ask, Minister, the benefits of having the two separate documents, MPF and the Scottish planning policy?
I suppose it's then helpful to understand the purpose of both when looking at... See, some people will see the National Planning Framework as almost an investment document for Scotland. It's heralded in the planning profession and other parts of the world. It's a great example of a vision and a policy document that sets out what we want to achieve in a spatial way. So National Planning Framework is about a spatial strategy, bringing together the range of other government strategies and a spatial expression of government policy, be that around energy or transport or economic activity or indeed protection of the environment. Scottish planning policy itself is where planners would turn to learn more about individual localised decisions in terms of what material considerations to apply, although that's supplemented through planning advice notes as well, of course. But it's how to conduct a planning decision and what issues should be taken into account, the how of the planning system, whereas MPF 3 is more of the where. Now, in terms of how both come together, clearly they're complementary. I am left wondering, as I suppose a relatively new minister in post for now over 2 years, that this is the first time that both have been reviewed together, and I think that that's the right thing to do. It was suggested by others, and I think what that will lead to is greater harmony between the two, a more joined-up approach, but they both serve a slightly different purpose in the same system.
Thank you. Anne McTaggart, please.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, Minister, and morning panel. You'd mentioned in your statement, Minister, about the engaging with people and participative mapping, and it was probably easier for you to say than me. But could I ask about some of the main issues, whilst engaging with people from some of the main issues that they have reported to you, how has that been incorporated in the proposed framework?
Anne McTaggart will be well aware that there are certain controversial areas in politics, and not least the planning system, on individual applications. And sometimes when developments are proposed, they won't meet with absolute approval, whether that's telecommunication masts, energy plants, the siting of wind turbines and so on. So sometimes there will be controversies and a balance to be struck. But in the engagement process, we try to follow a plan-led system, so that we have a rough plan of where developments should go. And in terms of the national designations, for example, Grangemouth, I would cite where there's not a unanimous view that a development there in terms of carbon capture would be universally supported. But there will be some local objections, there will be some local opposition to that. Now, you take that into account and then you form a balanced judgment. We make a decision whether it's in the national interest, whether it's in the local interest, whether it's the right thing to do. How we've engaged, so it's about decisions, it's about policies and choices, but how we have engaged and what's different than MPF 2 is the way we've engaged. So we published a participation statement which we shared on how we would go out to the public, to interested groups and to the profession and to all stakeholders as well. And what's different is that use of participatory processes such as the maps, rather than simply ask people what are you for and what are you against. You know, if development should have to go ahead, if there's certain national need, where would you locate? If there's transport improvements required, where should they be? And we tried to map that out to take a different approach in the methodology. In terms of numbers of people that have participated in the process, there were more people that had engaged through the submissions and attendance to our events. And we didn't just go to the normal, where you'd expect to go, planning events. We even went to a supermarket or a shopping centre, I should say, in Edinburgh. You know, you're out for your shopping and you get faced with MPF3 and Scottish planning policy. And by the way, I was there as Minister, not to conduct the retail exercise, but to engage with individuals on planning matters. So the unaware citizens of Edinburgh were engaged, for example, in a way that maybe they hadn't been expecting. Over and above engaging with community councils, local authorities, planning officials, the government's planning, e-networks, over and above all of that, we held a number of local meetings, including targeting areas where national developments were proposed, so that they had that extra say in whether those proposed national candidate projects would progress. So I hope that reassures you that we've been very engaging in how we've conducted this. What it hasn't been is a referendum on MPF3, I would concede that. But essentially that's the job of Parliament, is it not, to scrutinise that which we put forward.
Thank you, Minister.
Mark MacDonald, please.
Thank you, Convener. Obviously, beneath MPF3 there will be strategic development plans being developed across Scotland, and also local development plans being developed by local authorities. Can I ask the Minister, how do you see the linkage of all of these documents and all of these processes, and how do we ensure that local development plans and strategic development plans are cognizant of MPF3 and vice versa?
That's an excellent question, Mr MacDonald, and certainly that's the way the planning system should work. This policy sits, once agreed, sits at the top of the planning hierarchy and should then inform as a material consideration the development plans at a local level. And incidentally, we should engage better with community planning in that process too, and we have to build stronger connections to make sure that that happens. Of course, community planning is quite separate from spatial planning, but in terms of the national planning framework, this will then lead to, as happened in MPF2 and previous iteration, it informing and helping shape development plans across the country. You see, part of the difficulty is far too many planning authorities haven't kept their local development plans up to date. It's not necessarily that they've ignored MPF2, it's just that their development plan is not less than 5 years old, which incidentally is a statutory requirement, which is why I've put so much energy into the performance of planning authorities to get their local development plans up to date so that we can hold true to the plan-led system, which is why I welcome Parliament's support for my particular action plan approved recently in terms of performance in the planning system. But it is vital that once we get agreement, that then informs the other development plans. And in a perfect world, if everything was perfectly synchronised, which unfortunately is not, you would have the local development plans following straight after this national plan. The reason that's not in the case is it's traditionally been out of sync. If we were to start with a blank page, we would agree this, and then we would start again in local development plans. That's impractical because of the system as we have inherited it, but the best we can do is make sure that local development plans are kept up to date, are alive and alert to changing circumstances and policies, and that's where Scottish planning policy will come in to assist us in achieving the aspirations in MPF3. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, the convener and I will remember the local development plan held that was in place in Aberdeen for many years. Can I ask, in terms of that, the authorities who don't have up-to-date local development plans, what role you have in getting them into line, essentially?
As one of the key performance indicators that I outlined last time I think I visited the committee, that local development plans be less than 5 years old, I think this is a timely opportunity to ensure that they are, and I think my new planning fee regime will assist incentivising planning authorities to get on with it where they haven't done beforehand. Sometimes, frankly, electoral cycles can get in the way. Sometimes it may be a legal challenge, which, let's face it, has bedevilled a number of planning issues. And sometimes it's a comprehensive engagement process that I would welcome. But if we engage properly at the earliest, if we have proper consultation with elected members and communities, I'm convinced we can get the development plans right and hold true to the plan-led system. But I would encourage all planning authorities, once these policies are agreed, to ensure that they're adopted in their emerging local plans as quickly as possible. But of course, in any determination locally, the national planning framework and the Scottish planning policy would have to be considered as a material consideration, irrespective of where the local development plan is, once this is agreed by the summer.
Okay. I note at Annex A, a number of national developments are outlined, but that no timescales are attached to these. Is there any particular reason why no timescales were attached, given that these are obviously considered to be highly significant national developments?
The reason there's no specific timescales attached to each, there's some indicative timescales, of course, in the NPF 3 itself as a proposed document at the end in terms of significant events that are taking place, not necessarily that which is just in NPF 3. The reason we can't attach timescales to it, although we've got an action plan with 30 points as well, some of them are wholly with, say, for example, within the private sector. Now, what we are saying is there is a need for such a development, there is support for such a development, but we can't compel, for example, the private sector to deliver it. And therefore, it would be wrong for us to set timescales for others to deliver that which is theirs. But we're certainly accepting in the national planning framework that there's need, there's demand, and it has the government's support. There are some projects, of course, in the public sector that government or other partners will be delivering, where there will be a timescale, but that would be a matter for them. It would be wrong for us as the planning authority to say you must do it by a certain date, when essentially what we are saying is it's in the national interest and therefore we support it. So some will have timescales and some won't, depending on the nature of the individual development. Having said that, of course, there are clear national targets that we should achieve, such as the climate change targets, which of course are set by Parliament, and they inform our thinking, but it would be wrong for us to attach a timescale on an individual planning application which still has to go through the system, and we mustn't prejudice that despite attaching significance to it, as we have done in NPF 3.
Okay. Finally, I mean, the committee's been doing a large amount of work on regeneration. How do you see NPF 3 and SPP working to improve the regeneration of deprived communities?
Well, in policy terms, we absolutely support the regeneration of what you would call brownfield sites, or what's often referred to in policy documents now as previously developed land or vacant or derelict land. Whatever we call it, we know we want to develop there first, and we know when we're looking at development, you would want to develop areas that have previously been developed as opposed to, for example, greenfield or greenbelt sites. So we're trying to redirect efforts and redirect and direct, prioritise development. That's where it can make the biggest difference, where we can tackle disadvantage, where we can focus on some of the priorities, say from Christie, what's more sustainable, where success can be found, where are the opportunities across the country. For some communities, that might actually be the renewables sector. There might be income or job opportunities there. And for others, attaching national importance. For example, at Ravenscraig is a good example where there's an immense opportunity for mixed use, including housing, where progress has somewhat stalled. Attaching national significance to it, I think, is an aid to leveraging in investment and support and confidence to, in that case, redevelop one of the largest pieces of derelict land in the country. So we're attaching some individual significance to some individual sites, but more widely, our policies support tackling regeneration through the planning system, and very supportive and creative around that. But I would say again, it's not a spending document, it's a planning document.
Okay.
Thank you. John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Timely intervention in relation to the Minister's final comments in terms of Ravenscraig. And I think the Minister knows my views in relation to Ravenscraig, and I welcome the fact that it has been listed as an NPF 3 project, despite the fact that it has been in the local plan of North Lanarkshire Council for a number of years. And one of the reasons for the failure to take off, I would say, would be the lack of investment, in particularly in housing developments in that site. But taking that aside, it's really to concentrate on Mark MacDonald's line of questions, and that is, where does the local plan and the process fit into NPF? Because what we are saying in terms of the SPP is we ask local authorities to develop in conjunction with developers, local communities and local residents their local plan. And then what we see is the NPF then comes in and to paraphrase you, Minister, overarching decisions by the Scottish Government says that NPF should take priority over local plans. Is that the case? Because if it is the case, are we saying that the debates, discussions, consultation to develop local plans in many respects could be seen to be pointless?
Minister.
No, on the contrary, the local development plan is the most local embodiment, of the plan-led system, but it should be informed by the national planning framework. It's not really for the national planning framework to try and determine in every locale the designation or the zoning of every piece of land. That's absolutely for the local development plan, and that's what it would achieve. But if you have, for example, a national development, of which, of course, we have a number, and not all of them are site-specific. Some of them will extend across the country. So take the digital fibre network, which is a new inclusion to the national planning framework. You would expect, would you not, that that degree of infrastructure to have support if we want to be part of the kind of electronic revolution and take advantage of the opportunities that are there. So that's highlighted in the national planning framework. It might not be referred to in a local development plan, but it should be going forward so they can rely on each other. But that's not to say that something will get a consent at a local level just because it's in the national planning framework, because I've set out how the importance we attach gives greater certainty for the national developments. But absolutely, this planning policy and how it relates to Scottish planning policy should inform local decisions. So it doesn't undo the work that's been done at a local level for a local development plan. It informs it and helps shapes it by setting out national priorities. And incidentally, it normally carries a great deal of support from the local authorities because we work very closely with them on whatever the national policies and national developments are. Of course, we've got a number of stakeholders we need to listen to arrive at the right decision. So it's not really been the case that there's a great deal of opposition to what we are proposing at a local level, or indeed any great conflict with local development plans as they exist. It's more a timing issue about which one follows the other. And in terms of your comments around Ravenscraig, I do remember discussing that last time we discussed National Planning Framework 3. And of course we've proposed to retain at Ravenscraig. But I'm very mindful of your comments around displacement and net growth and net benefit. And that's exactly why we discuss that in relation to town centres more widely in Scottish planning policy, on which we've given a position statement to the committee.
Minister, memory serves me correctly, when this committee considered NPF2, the then Minister, Stuart Stevenson, came along and gave us a matrix of how they had measured the various projects that had been presented to the Government to be included in NPF2. Could the Minister outline how many projects were originally presented to the Government? And I understand a number of the projects won't come from local authorities or developing companies, because there are quite clearly in NPF3 a number of strategic overarching Scotland-wide projects in terms of high voltage transmission lines, pump storage projects within this. But it would be useful just to find out, because I know in the past there have been a number of developers have indicated that they would like to see projects being included in the NPF process. But as I said, it would just be of interest how many projects were presented, how many were considered, and what scoring system was used to finally identify the projects that are before us today.
Minister.
I'm happy to confirm I'll certainly do it by writing so I get the numbers exact for Mr Wilson. I wouldn't want to mislead the committee with an inaccuracy.
For the committee.
I thought you already had that information in terms of number of candidate projects that were submitted. More than happy to provide the number of projects. There were over 100 candidate projects submitted. We have a matrix, same as my predecessor, Mr Stevenson, in fact, before It was Aileen Campbell, and before that was Mr Stevenson. But we have a matrix that we use to have a criteria for consideration to make it to national proposal status. There were a great number of candidates, and we were able to take it to 14, which coincidentally, of course, is the same number as MPF2, but they're constructed in a slightly different way. So we went through a very methodical process as to how we arrived at the final number, and I can share that with the committee. It's quite a weighty document in terms of the criteria used, the analysis, the scoring, and then the final outcome, but more than happy to share that with the committee. But there were over 100 of candidate projects that we considered.
Thank you, Mr Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Just to go back, Minister, in terms of the SPP, and now you have made reference to the local planning process and local authorities keeping their local plans up to date. You're well aware of my interest in a local plan that was developed by North Lanarkshire Council, which went through a lengthy appeals process, and following reference to the DPA was then amended and then returned to the local authority because they felt there wasn't enough residential development identified in the local plan. In one particular area, I'm aware that there's urban growth proposals within the local plan, but recently there has been a development presented to the council, and it was considered because of the nature of the development, because it was out with not only the local plan, but the Clyde Valley Strategic Plan, and it's now been referred to ministers for consideration, and I don't expect the minister to respond to that particular development. The point I'm trying to raise, Minister, is that development was contrary to the strategic plan, was contrary to the local plan agreed by appeal, and encroaches on the green belt. What assurances can local residents and local individuals within areas throughout Scotland that have went through that process of agreeing a local plan, agreeing a strategic plan, agreeing urban growth areas, only to find that those plans are thrown aside because developers can then step in and decide to make submissions out with that process?
Minister.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener. To then answer the previous question, because that's apparently the subject of the next committee I'll be appearing in front of for this policy document, the exact number of formal proposals for national status were 242, so that will take a bit longer for you to go through them, Mr Wilson, but more than happy to share it with you. On your point around departing from the plan, it is acceptable within the planning system to depart from the plan if material considerations allow and it leads you to that conclusion. So it is possible if an application comes in that there are considerations that either elected members or indeed if it has delegated authority or indeed ministers choose to depart from the plan, support such an application. And you're absolutely right, I won't refer to any live planning application, wouldn't prejudice or compromise either the committee or myself in doing so. But it is possible to depart from the plan if there's a material consideration such as, for example, economic benefit of an application or number of jobs or number of houses that's deemed to be required. So there are sometimes occasions when you can depart from the plan in any application as long as it's been determined in a transparent, open and accountable way, and those material considerations can be explained. It has been the case that we can depart from the plan, which would take me to one of the significant changes, I think, in SPP, which is as Minister, as part of a government whose overarching purpose, in terms of making Scotland flourish, is around sustainable economic growth. And I think we have to attach greater weighting to economic growth within the planning system, not just in performance, ensuring that the right development is in the right places and we maintain our adherence to quality. But I want to see a stronger emphasis on economic impact, on economic growth within planning policies going forward. And that's why we've consulted very rigorously on the presumption in favour of sustainable development, which is why I've asked for greater detail on economic impact to be attached to planning applications in a very open narrative. And that's why I've said that there must be a due weight attached to economic impact in planning decisions going forward. So from all of that, I'd say yes, we might depart from the local plan sometimes, but as long as it can be evidenced why that's been the case and all matters have been taken into account.
Minister, I accept the need for sustainable development and I fully understand that in economic growth. but do those come at the cost of eradication of the green belt or other developments which have been identified, such as urban growth developments included in local plans? And because the issue is the balance, the opportunity costs between the sustainable developments, economic growth, protection of the green belt and protection of the local planning process, local planning consultation process, which many people feel can be undermined by particular developments. And is the Minister minded to give greater strength to the local consultation, the local engagement, the local involvement in relation to ensuring that what we develop as a nation are developments that people can buy into, rather than developments that are actually can be, in some cases, be seen to be foisted upon neighbourhoods?
I would be very careful if the member's not trying to take a view on the planning system based on one application or experience of one application or one development plan. But what I would say is that where I agree with you is greater engagement with communities is a good thing. Greater pre-application consultation is a good thing. Better involvement with elected members is very worthwhile and is a good thing. And all of those are supported in the action plan around planning. So I accept all of that. And getting local development plans right should involve greater participation. So I agree with all of that. To then get a credible, robust local plan, absolutely, that's timely, up to date, reflects current policies and current circumstances, but I also think it must be adept. And I think it must be able to deal with individual circumstances. Where I disagree with you is it's not a choice between economic growth or sacrificing the green belt. Yes, for some local development plans to meet the needs on, say, housing need, in some areas there may well be a requirement to release, for example, greenbelt, but that would be a matter to be determined locally, ideally, in finding the right housing sites. Just as an example, but I'll give you an even better example. Let's say there was a designation in a city or a town for a piece of land for industrial use, but it's in dereliction and can't be developed. And then a house builder comes along and is interested in developing it for housing. Would we really just say no and dismiss all the considerations about housing need and demand and economic growth and needs of industry and skills and local connectability and sustainability? Would we really just dismiss that because it's been zoned as industrial? In a purist way, no, we wouldn't. We'd be a bit more creative than that. And that's why I think the planning system has to be flexible, but abide by the local development plan as best we can. So I think it's a fairly complex area. But to go back to the area of agreement, good engagement will make all the difference. And I think we'll get greater satisfaction from the planning system if people are engaged at the earliest point rather than simply become an objector at the end.
Minister, living in Lanarkshire, I know the number of brownfield sites that could be developed and should be developed, so I'm well aware of the need to try and get developments on those sites, and Ravenscraig's a perfect example of that. Thank you. Convener.
Cameron Buchanan, please.
Minister, good morning. I'm still not convinced that the benefits of NPF and SPP being separate documents. I just wonder why. I can't quite see the reasoning behind it. You explained at the beginning, but it just doesn't quite resonate with me.
Yeah, I suppose it's more helpful, if we think back to where they were before, not only were they separate documents, they were consulted upon separately and they were arrived at separately, and, if any correlation between the policies happened, it was almost by accident rather than the design, in a sense. Now we have a process where they're being considered together, consulted upon together so that they make sense. And a great example is around energy, because we'll say some things about energy in National Planning Framework, and then we'll set policies in Scottish Planning Policy. So I suppose the difference will be, if I could try again, the National Planning Framework is a spatial expression of where the government think development should go largely. The key issues for the nation, the key opportunities, and indeed, yes, some of the challenges too, such as brownfield sites, previously developed land, inequality and so on. So it's a spatial expression of various government strategies, various opportunities, and that sets out the where, almost. Planning policy sets out the how. Now, in terms of how that might change, of course, there could be a review of Scottish planning policy at any time to take cognizance of circumstances. Telecommunications is an example where I think our policies are outdated, and that's why I've consulted on changing that. That's an area that may again change at some point in the future. So as we update MPF3 and as we have monitoring arrangements for that. I think Scottish planning policy, that which advise planning authorities on the issues they should take into account on individual decisions, I think has to be separate in terms of as a document and as a guide from National Planning Framework 3. I don't know if a third attempt at answering the question will help you somewhat, or the colleagues behind me, the professionals beside me, can further advise, but I think my exposure to the system in the last 2 years has led me to the conclusion that having the policies integrated, closely aligned, consulted upon together makes absolute sense, but there's a very cogent reason to have the policy documents and themselves separate. It really boils down to National Planning Framework is the where, Scottish planning policy is the how.
Okay. The other question is, I wonder if 60 days is enough really for proper scrutiny for National Planning Framework. It seems a very short time to me, 60 days. Is there any reason behind that?
But normally the Conservatives complain that the planning system takes too long.
Well,
not this truncated. Well, let me.
Not a compromise then.
Yeah. Well, let me answer the question seriously rather than a flippant remark. Then, if it was just the 70 days, Mr. Buchanan, I would agree with you. I would agree with you if it was just the 60 days. That was the sum total of this exercise. But considering we kicked off this last April, the process, there was the draft National Planning Framework, the consultation engagements, so it's been going on much longer than the 60-day parliamentary exposure that it will now enjoy. The entire consultation process has been much wider and longer, but the 60 days is that which Parliament has decided in 2006 by the Act is what Parliament should have to consider it. So you're right, if it was just 60 days for this whole process, that would be unacceptable. But it's been going on for a great number of months now, last year and into this year, and then, of course, concludes by the summer of this year.
So that's just to conclude it, it's to try and sort of bring it to a close, is that right?
Well, that's right. In terms of the parliamentary process, it's 60 days of parliamentary scrutiny. But, of course, we've been dealing with this, and the last time I appeared in this committee was out with that 60-day process. This is just the formal period of us laying it, you considering it, and then us concluding it. But the entire consultation engagement process has been far more extensive than this. I suppose some people are surprised that it does take as long, but I think it's right we take the time to get it right.
The other, can I just ask another question? Thank you very much. The other question I was going to ask is, why is the A9, for example, not in the targets, the upgrading of the A9? I mean, that seems to be one of the most important things that people are asking about, and it was originally in part of your, I think, manifesto some time ago.
I'm going to be very careful round about individual projects.
All right.
The reality is that we could start listing all of us projects that are dear to our own hearts.
The A9 is pretty important to people.
Minister, very briefly,
Right.
and I have to say that anyone else who comes in with a huge amount of individual projects will be ruled out of order on them. Minister.
It's simply to say that the A9, of course, is already a commitment, and Transport colleagues could speak to that. It doesn't require to be in the National Planning Framework because it doesn't require that consenting support. So it may well still be a national priority for the government, but it doesn't require the planning support as attached by National Planning Framework, and therefore there's no reason to doubt its progress, but it doesn't require this particular status, as a number of road infrastructure projects wouldn't require that status either.
Okay. Stuart McMillan, please.
Convener. Good morning, Minister, and your team. Last night at the cross-party group on recreational boating and marine tourism, which I chair, this issue was actually raised by a couple of the members. Obviously, it was raised in the context of sailing and recreational boating. So when I get back to the flat last night, I looked at the document again, and there are three particular paragraphs that I think actually I wanted to highlight certainly to you today. 313, 427 and 5.8. It's the 313, also regarding the ports and harbours. Would the government be content if there is going to be, with further investment in ports and harbours, would the government be content for them to be considered to be more of a multi-use facility as compared to just a harbour for a ferry or a port for a ferry or whatever? Would you be more prepared to wish for them to be kind of multi-use facilities as compared to just one, a single use?
I think it would depend on the circumstances of the individual site, because they will vary. Some of the ports and harbours have clearly been identified in MRAP, the National Renewables Infrastructure Plan. So some of them will have different purposes, and some of their purposes have changed from the previous iteration NPF2. So the policies can be quite adept. And Mr Baker, I suppose, for example, Mr MacDonald would be particularly interested in, say, Aberdeen, which there's a great use of competition, a great deal of use at the Aberdeen Harbour, and it's identified as a national designation, and competition for its use as well. So it's an example of we wouldn't necessarily want to prioritise, but we're saying where the opportunities are, certainly. And in your specific interest around leisure and tourism and recreation, of course we want to see more of those opportunities unlocked around the coast, and particularly where there maybe has been regeneration issues as well. So what we're trying to do is more clearly in this document express the opportunities that exist without being too prescriptive, but we're certainly highlighting them in a way that we weren't able to do so before. That's partly down to having a marine strategy and having land use planning connect to marine planning as well. So can we be flexible? Yes, we can, but do we see opportunities in various parts of Scotland for the renewables industry? Well, yes, as well.
A further point that was raised last night was regarding the potential for some new maritime marine facilities to be created. But one of the problems in some of the examples that was provided last night was the lack of broadband access. So if this is where kind of tying the three different paragraphs comes in, if the government are happy or are keen to see multi-use facilities where appropriate, because it certainly could help aid not just the sailing community, but it certainly could the whole wider marine tourism sector, which actually kind of brings in some of the region of around about £300 million at the present moment to the Scottish economy. Certainly if there was better broadband access, would that be something that the government would be keen to encourage?
Yes, absolutely, both in our investment plans to encourage broadband, and for that matter mobile coverage as well. That's why the policies have to be updated in terms of digital infrastructure and connectivity to cover as much as the country as we can. And some of the more rural areas have maybe missed out in the past because of commercial demand, and that's why the policies are calibrated to try and get coverage to all parts of Scotland. And specifically in relation to telecommunications, I'll shortly launch an exercise, a consultation on telecommunications to ensure that we've got the right planning regime to support the development in every part of the country. And I think you touched on page 34, section 4.27 as well, where we specifically refer to outdoor recreation and sailing. So I think the areas in which you've touched upon are covered in the document. But of course the document, if you'll forgive me, I've tried to keep it as concise as we possibly can while saying as much as we can as well, and we could have said a lot more. Things are not refused because of their omission, but clearly where there's opportunities we've tried to cover it. So I don't disagree with anything that Mr McMillan has said this morning.
And kind of one final question, Convener. It's regarding the town centre first policy. Obviously that's been in operation in Scotland since 1990, yet we have seen some town centres in the country decline in terms of the number of people going there and shops closing and the proliferation of other shops that certainly many members of those communities don't really want to see an increase of. And so, in terms of the NPF and SPP, what actually what can the government do to really try to kind of stimulate kind of town centres that we actually have in the country, particularly those where there has been a decline in their fortunes in recent years?
There are three main strands I would point to. The trying to create dynamic and resilient places in NPF3, and we identify individual towns as demonstrations to illustrate how policies make a difference. In SPP, you're absolutely right, there's been a sequential approach, but only in terms of retail for planning the town centre first priority in terms of just retail, and we're proposing to extend that to all types of development, so that any development we're considering would be put through the same process. That could it be located in the town centre first? If it can't, then look further to the edge of town, and then out of town and so on. So we extend the sequential approach, as well as other new elements such as having a health check in our town centres, and that to help inform the planning process as well. And of course the third element is the government's own town centre action plan, and to assist those decision makers of what town centre first policy should look like and how it should be applied. We've established a working group so that we've got chapter and verse as to how to apply it, and that will conclude in good time for these policies being put in place. But I suppose the key element is to extend the sequential approach, as you've described it, that we should try and prioritise development in the town centre first, and only if it can't go there, look elsewhere. And that's easier within some sectors than others. And then, of course, there's a range of other actions that we're taking to try and support our town centres, as we debated not so long ago in Parliament, in terms of general rejuvenation of our town centres, diversification, rehousing, demonstration projects, the use of the digital revolution, the cultural element in events, accessibility, and then of course rates, business rates would have an impact as well. But specifically in relation to planning policy, it's very supportive of town centres as a place to do business, to live, to learn, and indeed to enjoy. We need diversification, repopulation, and then local solutions for local towns, because of course it will differ from one town to another. But the planning protection, I think, is being strengthened for town centres as opposed to weakened. That said, town centres will still face a multitude of challenges, from internet shopping, changing footfall, people being more mobile and choosing to go elsewhere, maybe other localised matters also. So I think there's a range of issues that affect our town centres, but planning policy is certainly very alive to that, which is why we've attached such importance to it in both documents.
Okay. Richard Baker, please.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, I'm well that you said in response to Ms MacDonald that this is a planning document and not a spending document, a national planning framework, but would not have been sensible to attach at least some budgetary and financial information to the document, particularly in terms of Scottish Government sponsored projects, to give confidence that the outcomes that have been set forward in the document will actually be achieved?
I'm not really sure why it would have been helpful in the planning document. Certainly it's helpful in strategy documents, for example, transport strategy documents. I'm not sure what they would have added to a planning document individually when what we're setting out as policy, sites of national importance, the status that they should enjoy, then our timescale in terms of the end of the document, and the ongoing action plan. So I'm not sure what added value we would have got from attaching the value, the economic value or cost of a project to the document itself. It's a fair point. I just don't see how it assists the planners in terms of the decisions they make, which is why I point out it's a planning document, not a spending document. I
appreciate the Minister's point of view, Convener, but I think it's about the confidence in the ambitions of the document being achieved. And so building on that, what action have you taken, Minister, to reassure yourself that in terms of investment in planning and planning departments at a local authority level, the resources there are sufficient to ensure that these objectives can actually be achieved at a local level?
No, I think that's a good question. Resourcing within the planning system is something that we've taken very seriously, and of course the main source of income for the planning service would be the planning fees, and that's why we increased planning fees by a record 20%. That's the largest increase in planning fees since this Parliament was created. That income has assisted, I think, local authorities, and there's been individual grants to support advisors within the planning system and the planning service itself. So there is an issue that's been identified by Audit Scotland around resourcing of the planning system, but I'm convinced that the increase of the planning fee has helped. And then the focus work of the high-level group that I co-chair with COSLA has also looked at the resourcing issue. So I'm fairly confident that, generally speaking, planning authorities are equipped to do their job adequately. And the variance in performance, I think, is less to do with resourcing down to other issues.
Okay, and one final question, Convener, and it's on the it's from TAPLAN on the SPP. They suggested that in terms of the 12 principles set out in the draft SPP, they may result in more debate on what weight is attached to these and how they're used, rather than being used positively as guiding principles. And they suggested that more guidance will be required in terms of their application and use. Is that something that you're actively looking at?
I fully expect, as with any planning document and guiding principles, that guidance will follow, and that's why there's the plethora of planning advice notes, so further guidance would follow to assist planners on how to conduct the decisions that they make. But I have tried to keep the principles as concise as possible. Thank you.
Mr Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Just as an aside, Minister, the proposals in terms of Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill to exempt local authority planning functions from the proposed duty in terms of sustainable economic growth, how does that sit with what you've said this morning in terms of the priorities about sustainable economic growth in relation, if you're going to take that out, the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill for local authorities? How do you intend to balance that to make sure local authority planning authorities do ensure that that's part of the criteria that's used when developing projects?
It's a very good question. I appreciate the opportunity to again clarify it, and hopefully we did that through the course of the Regulatory Reform Bill. The duty, a legal duty on the planning service to deliver that in the way that was described in the Regulatory Reform Bill would have been inappropriate for the planning service, because the planning decisions are set out, of course, in previous Act and not least the 2006 legislation. So I think it's important that we protect the purity of the planning system in what issues it should consider. Economic impact and the government's policies are clearly considered when applying planning logic. But if we had had, if you can imagine, if we had had the duty of sustainable economic growth as a legal duty as opposed to a policy, then we may have ended up in court every time a planning application was turned down. Every time it would have been a new court of appeal for the planning system. Now, we've got an appeals process. It's the DPEA, and if people don't like it, there's other legal recourse, but it's specifically on planning policy. If we had created a law and a duty around that, it would have simply have created a scenario where, as I say, every planning application would have been subject to an individual determination by a judge or a sheriff in court, and whether that was applied in every planning application. And that would have ground the planning system to a halt, I suspect, where people had the money to do so. So it didn't feel appropriate. Now, how we then get delivery on sustainable economic growth and sustainable development is through policy, through the national planning frameworks, through Scottish planning policy, and through the guidance notes. And that's far more appropriate for the planning system, with its starting position as the plan-led system, and it's very clear in the law how planning decisions should be taken. So yes, there's an expectation we deliver sustainable economic growth. I do not accept this false argument that there's a difference between sustainable economic growth and sustainable development. It's the same thing, they're complementary. We can design policies that they are in harmony and can be delivered. If I read out the definition of both of them, I think you would struggle to tell me which was which. I think they're in keeping with each other, and therefore we can deliver sustainable economic growth and sustainable development as part of the policy mix, rather than what would have been inappropriate as a legal duty, which is quite separate to the planning system and how it operates. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much, Minister. I'll wait and see the purity of the planning process.
Final question, Minister, and you mentioned the word harmony, and sometimes there's not much harmony when it comes to planning, and according to some members of the public, there's not that much common sense either, it has to be said. One of the things which has often been brought to my attention in my own neck of the woods and elsewhere is where there is contradiction, where a local development plan says one thing, and then the strategic development plan says something different. One of the things which I've noticed of late is that things feature in the local development plan don't feature in the regional plan, and yet various planners say that a development is of regional importance. How do we get these things right, and how do we stop the situation where the public are confused and upset by certain things like this? How do we inject common sense?
That's a very good question. I'd like to think it exists in decision makers, and they are supported with the advice, the guidance and clarity and policy direction, and that's what we've tried to achieve in the current review. But I think you're right, Convener. If I was to tell you we're going to get absolute harmony in the planning system, that just would not be the case, because many planning decisions is about conflict. It's about one person's preference over another, or individual stakeholders having a different opinion over land use and what land should be used for. So there will always be conflict, but as long as we can conduct it in an open, transparent, accountable way with clarity of purpose and what issues have been taken into the mix as a material consideration, then we should have confidence in the system. Good levels of engagement is to be encouraged, good levels of member participation is to be encouraged, and where you have that conflict between development plan, the kind of strategic development plans and local plans, of course we want them to be more streamlined. I've actually conducted some research, or commissioned some research into the value of the strategic development plans to see how they're interplaying, what added value they have brought to the planning process, and I'm happy to share that with the committee once we have it. But there is an issue about as I kind of covered earlier and expanded upon, the issue about what comes first, the national planning framework, then the local plan, and then of course we have that interplay with the strategic development plan. So we'll try and get harmony within that. The front page of the UK Planner magazine has the Scottish Government's Planning Minister with the title The Modern Evangelist. So if I'm being evangelical for the planning system in Scotland, it's going south of the border. So I will do my best to deliver harmony in Scotland and then take it south to London as well, Convener.
Thank you very much for that, Minister. I hope you enjoy the scrutiny of this at the other committees that you've got to visit as well within the 60-day period. Thanks for your evidence. I'll suspend now for 5 minutes for a change of witnesses. Thank you. We now move on to this morning's second panel. I'd like to welcome Petra Bieberbach, Chief Executive for Planning Aid Scotland, Neil Collar, Head of Planning Law at Brodie's, Robin Holder, Chief Executive of Holder Planning, and Pam Ewan, the SPDA Manager for Tayplan. Welcome to you all. Would anyone like to make any opening remarks? No? In which case we'll move straight on to the questioning. If I could start maybe with Mr. Collar. You have said that there may be merit in the MPF and SPP being a single document. You were here, I think, to hear the Minister's explanations earlier. Why do you think that there is merit in the two being a single document?
Thank you, Convener. I think it's been interesting that because this time round they've been run in tandem, it has highlighted the fact that there are two separate documents, but they are very connected to each other, and quite a lot of the questions we were asked to respond to highlighted that. And I was very interested to listen to the questions this morning and the Minister's explanation. I think what I took out of that was the two documents have different purposes, and he referred to, very broadly, the how and the where. But my personal feeling listening to it was this is a process of evolution, and personally I feel it could evolve further, and that having them as a single document really does justify serious consideration, because it did strike me that it would be possible to have one document that addresses both purposes and could make it clear those differing purposes, but still be a single document, which would just be easier for us all to refer to.
Does anybody else have a view on that? Mr. Holder?
Yes, I think I really endorse everything that Mr. Collins says. I think the how and the where are inextricably linked. And the sense I have in reading the two separate documents, I don't know this to be so, but they appear as if they've been written by different people, and the tone of the documents is different. Maybe that comes because the difference between the how and the where. But I get a different sense of, if you like, conclusion and outcome in those two documents. And if anything, the SPP is a little bit more cautious, seeks a little bit more balance here and there. I also think that the MPF3 does extend into policy areas, and where it does so, I'm not sure it necessarily is saying the same as SPP.
I wonder if I can move on to Ms. Bieberbach. And Planning Aid for Scotland in their written submission says that there needs to be a much greater raising of awareness amongst the public of MPF3 in Scottish planning policy. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes. Do I have to press anything? No.
No, you
just
don't.
goes automatically. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to present today. One of the areas of great concern to us since the 2006 planning reform, which obviously had the twin aim of inclusivity and efficiency, a lot has been done, a lot of good work has been done around driving forward a more efficient planning system. What we would like to see is a more inclusive planning system. And by exclusivity, we don't mean a homogeneous one view supporting public, but actually a greater dialogue. But in order to achieve that, we have to raise considerably the level of awareness that we have such a thing as the planning system in Scotland. Because the planning system is a public service, and like no other public service, it's actually open up at the earliest opportunity for people to engage with. But it's often very late in the process that people know about planning. And because it's late, they then become very entrenched with the views, they then become very, shall we say, distrustful of not only the process, but also what is being presented. If we flipped it around, and if we had truly a system where people could engage at all levels, at all the time, then I think we would find ourselves in a system that is more efficient, more transparent, and more representative. But I think in order to do that, we have to ask some really serious questions. Where do we want to get planning to? At what level do we want to have people engaged? Do we want active citizen? Is it time, therefore, to ask, should planning be taught as part of the active citizenship in schools? Should people learn about engagement and learning about articulating for and against? So yes, awareness raising is a big, big ask, and we have to address it.
I raised in my last question to the Minister the contradictions that sometimes exist, where something may feature in a local development plan not be in the strategic plan, even though planners and others have said that it is a strategic priority for a region. How does your organisation deal with these confusions as they arise? Because I would imagine that you probably get quite a lot of people coming to your organisation saying, well, this is in here, it's not in here, what actually counts?
And it's quite difficult to be generalist now about sort of specific matters. What we have got in Scotland is a plan-led system, and that is helpful. What we then also have is sometimes deviation from that, and it has to be explained around material consideration or whatever. The most important fact, I think, is that people need to have a trust in the system. They only get that if they're involved at the earliest opportunity. But maybe pass on to Neil on that, at that point in terms of the deviation to the different plans.
Thank you. I think what that highlights, what your question highlights and what the Minister was highlighting, was we have a system that tries to build in flexibility. And flexibility has its good points and its bad points. We were focusing there on helping the public to understand that things maybe seem to be contradictory. The flip side of that is those of us who advise developers also have to advise developers, we refer to it as consent risk. And one of the features of the British system, as opposed to others, is there's higher consent risk. In other words, there's less certainty because, yes, we have a plan-led system, but we also have the ability to take into account material considerations. So developers have a similar problem to members of the public in the sense that there's no guarantees. There can be contradictions. And unfortunately, I think that's something that we all find when we're explaining to people, yes, that document may say this, but this other document says that. Why? Well, they were prepared at different times. And again, that was a theme, I think, that came out earlier from the Minister. It's very hard to get the system in sync because it means doing various plans at similar times.
Can I stop you there? Because I think, you know, the timing is often used as an excuse in some regards. Let me give you an example in terms of the conflict between a local development plan and the strategic development plan, and yet it's said, you know, that this proposal still features very highly, and it's non-controversial as far as I'm concerned. Area that's in the plan, local development plan, for a site for a religious building, right? It doesn't feature in the strategic development plan, even though the planners have said that it is of strategic importance to a region. You know, there is conflict here when it appears in one, it doesn't appear in the other, and yet the planners continue to say it has strategic importance. I'm sure that this kind of thing happens quite a lot, and it's that kind of scenario, nothing to do with timing, which creates the difficulties, I think, amongst the general public who cannot understand what's going on. As a planner, Ms Ewan, do you want to?
I mean, just in terms of the comments and awareness, I think we all, as planners in the planning profession, constantly try really hard to reach people who wouldn't otherwise know how to engage with the planning process. And I think the work that's been done, the engagement and consultation as part of NPF3 has played a big part in that, because the numbers they have reached and going out into shopping centres, as the Minister said, and other locations really helps that. So you're trying to go to people rather than opening a community hall and getting them to come to you. Certainly in the work we do at TAPLAN, we have in the past, and we are about to do even more work with schools. Because I think when you're looking 20, 30, 40 years ahead, as I do in TAPLAN, as NPF3 does, it's actually the children who are 10, 17, 25 years old. I strongly believe that's the people we're planning for, not to discredit and not to take account of others and other age groups. But these are our young people, and that's really the homes that we are building for them and the jobs that we are creating, etc. So I would support, certainly government, looking at how we can more entrench people being involved in their places and shaping their places as part of the education programme, because it's actually quite hard to get into schools, get that door jarred open to get in and run workshops. But once you're in there, the head teachers see a huge difference. I think it's an interesting point you make, Convener, about, if something's in a strategic development plan and it's maybe, that relationship. And what is strategic is really one of the things that is lying behind what you're saying. And that will differ from areas. Strategic development plans focus on cross-boundary aspects that are strategic or really big strategic issues. So something might be seen as strategic within one local authority area, but actually it doesn't necessarily have to feature in the strategic development plan. And that could very well be different in the Tay-Plan area to the Aberdeenshire, to Glasgow and Clyde Valley, because they're different geographies, different places.
I understand that. It's when planners themselves contradict what they have done by saying, yes, it is strategic, and then not explaining the situation. And I think this is the difficulty that we sometimes have, and certainly that the public experience, where a huge amount of folk think that planners talk a different language to them. And I see Ms Bieberbach smiling there, and I'm sure she's experienced it in her job on a day-and-daily basis, where people feel, that the language that is being used is something that is completely and utterly alien to their everyday life. I'll maybe take Ms Bieberbach in there.
I think you're absolutely right. The language that is used in planning it's not the sort of day-to-day language that the average person would speak to. But we have to remember, it is a quasi-legal process, and therefore it is absolutely right to make sure that it's steeped in that sort of language. What Planning Aid offers is then some sort of translation service for that, translation as well as awareness raising. But once you sort of strip down the sort of language, once you take it back to the actual what it is about, it's about three key things. Planning is about the vision for Scotland, the vision for the UK, the vision for whatever. It's about a vision document. It's also about placemaking. It's about how well you want to live, how well you want to be connected, how you want to. I think as Harry Burns recently said, places are about well-being. And then the third one is about citizenship. It's about a good democracy and interaction, because you may say that you don't want to see, say, for example, a wind farm. Another person is absolutely adamant that they want to see more green technology and therefore they want to see wind farm. It's about different value system. It's about having a dialogue. That's what planning, like no other public service, actually does. And with regards to the earlier question about having a kind of differences in terms of strategic and other, or almost like contradiction, I think we can always be rest assured that there is some sort of timeline. Yes, there are plans, as the Minister said, who are already out of date or who are obsolete, and something else is coming on and that's newer. So I think it is important that the general public is being explained, is being encouraged to get involved, and is to be giving the information in an unbiased way.
It's a little bit derogatory about planners there, Ms Ewan. Do you want to respond in terms of the language situation?
No, I would in part agree with you, but actually in part I would agree with a lot of professions. When you're working as a professional in a profession, whether it's planning, transport, legal, other areas, you can become entrenched in your language that's comfortable to you. Certainly in Tay-Plan, we try hard, and we're working with Planning Aid Scotland and others, we try hard to get plain English there and think about how we are working with the public and how we are truly engaging with them, encouraging them to become engaged. So I think in part I would agree with you, but certainly I would reassure you that I think certainly in Tay-Plan and other authorities that I'm very aware of, there is a lot of effort to try and get that balance with getting plain English, but also getting the right balance that it is a legal document and it will be scrutinised and used for planning applications. So it sometimes is about that balance.
John Wilson, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. The question about engagement of the public, and because as a list MSP and like other MSPs in this room and in the Parliament, we often are approached by constituents who have been subjected to decisions that they don't understand why the decisions have been made. And it is about And it's fine for Mr Collar to say that the public engagement in NPF and SPP, the way that they went out and the government's consulted, clearly the overwhelming majority of the population don't engage until it's next door to them. And it's trying to, how do we get the message over to individuals who reside in an area that they know has been, next to them has been designated green belt, and then all of a sudden there's a development plan for that area, out with the local plan, out with the strategic plan. How do we explain to individuals what the planning system is about and how these decisions have been made, when clearly they are contrary to, as the convener had just highlighted, potentially the local plan or the strategic plan, or, as I mentioned earlier to the Minister, totally out of context with urban growth plans that have been designated for particular villages or towns.
Start with Mr Holder.
I think Petra touched on the fundamental issue, which is about education, because if people are coming into understanding all of this late in the day when proposals arise, it's almost impossible to bring them up to speed quickly. We've also got a huge complexity in the planning system, and it's developed over the years. And it's one of the reasons I referred to earlier. Well, I think, for example, Scotland should have a single national plan, not an SPP and a national planning framework. The first question people ask is, what's the difference? So I'm not sure they'll be clear on that. We have strategic development plans. We have local development plans. We have main issues reports on both of those documents. This has a sweep of years, usually, in terms of going from beginning to end. Because of the lack of timing, which Mr Collar referred to, or the out-of-sequence events, people simply don't understand where the process is at any one point in time. I attended a community council meeting last night to talk about a Greenbelt release somewhere in East Lothian. And really, I mean, community council, you would expect to be reasonably able to understand the system, or at least be informed. And they weren't. I don't blame them for that. But they really didn't have the faintest idea about how the planning process worked. And if they don't know, then we've got to take a step back somewhere in the system, because there's no good developers, consultants, or planning officers from councils going out into communities when they haven't had that early engagement.
I agree with your aspect. I think a lot of people find out about development or change in their town or village or city because when the application that's close to them, comes before them, and they find out that way. And I think it is about how do we entrench it more in our education system, because it's actually about educating people about how their places change, and they're constantly changing, and how they can get involved. I think what we do have is an internationally recognised, positively recognised development planning system in Scotland of the national plans, strategic development plans and local development plans. And I can say that with work I've done recently in Ireland and Wales. It is very well recognised, and I think we should celebrate that. But it's taking that, and the only way I can really see making a big difference is actually taking it into the education system with more, whether it's a secondary school in geography or whatever, and actually trying to entrench it more in that way through generations, and people have a greater understanding.
Collar?
I think actually I've got anything to add. I would just endorse what the others have said.
Bieberbach, do you?
Very quickly, you used the term greenbelt, which is of course a planning terminology. If you ask the general public out there, a greenbelt will be a green field. They won't understand what actually implications are of the greenbelt, and that's where we're already starting to use language that is planning language, which has a specific meaning, but to the general public it will not mean anything. I have to just explore on Robin's point is a very good one. Community councils, Local Government Act has given them a role within the planning system, but it's a limited function. It is to comment on planning application. It is not extended for them to become active in a development plan process, i.e. the proactive side of planning. We would love if you could consider to extend their role of community councils, because they are the level of local democracy that we're so much wanting to see, and that might actually help then to drive a greater awareness. Perhaps also look at the extension of, because like we all have experience of community councils that work very well, But there are lots of them that don't work very well at all, and there are some areas that have no more community councils. So that's quite worrying. We may want to look at extending the function of the 7 principle of public life to community councils, so that there is a transparency, there is a representational role. They have to be seen to be seeking the general public out there before they air views, and so on. So I want to just leave that thought with you.
Okay. Mr. Holder. Interrupt. One very important point is community engagement, important as it is. We already have a very slow planning system, and we can't let that issue extend the timescales of what we're dealing with here now.
Peter, it's just I think Ms Bieberbach highlighted the issue about the terminology that we use in planning, and Greenbelt is a perfect example of that. When the planners refer to Greenbelt, they refer to something different from someone who lives in that locality and sees a field being grazed by sheep or being sown with corn. They consider that to be Greenbelt, but that field may not always be designated as Greenbelt. How do we make sure that the consultation with local, and it's not just about education, I think it goes much wider than that, it's about how do we educate people and residents about what is meant by the language that is used by planners? Because this is, I think the Greenbelt terminology is a good example where, and we talk about brownfield sites, we talk about greenbelt sites, we talk about protected areas, sites of scientific interest, and yet at the same time we heard the Minister earlier saying that if there is material consideration, these designations may disappear. How do we get that message over to the general public?
And of course, developers refer to green ligature at certain points as well. Ms. Bieberbach.
Can I just, just very quickly, because I think it chimes with some of the things that were said earlier today. When the Minister launched the consultation on MPF3, at the same, I think it was the same week, we launched our Young Placemakers initiative. And our Young Placemaker initiative is all about involving and enthusing young people aged 16 to 25. What we would like to do is to work with all, and we're trialling it in the TAY plan area, so at the strategic level as well as the local level, just to enthuse young people around the planning system, what it does. We don't call it, I mean, we're not going in there and saying become planners or become architects or become planning lawyers, just become engaged citizens. Take an interest. Some young people, for example, in Orkney, the young placemaker there was particularly keen on renewable energy. The young girl in Perth and Kinross is interested in the gypsy traveller element there. So just take an issue that planning touches on and then enthuse the debate. And for young people, especially with the social media these days, we can reach a lot much quicker than ever before. And by doing that, we can start explaining the terminology as well.
You know, the issue, and I welcome the work that's been done to enthuse young people to get engaged in the process, but surely the planning process and the decision-making process is as complicated for developers as it is for the general public. And the simplification of the planning decision process would surely be better than what we've currently got at the present time.
Raising it because the question was asked, how do we raise awareness of the terminology? We've got to start somewhere. And don't forget, in Norway, for example, the young child has a right to be involved in the planning system, to be heard. We don't have that here. We may want to consider that.
The point I was trying to make is that the issue about the planning process, and if you engage individuals, and there's an expectation, if you engage with people, and in Norway the system is different, because young people, every citizen has a right to engage in the planning process. We don't have that right in the Scottish planning system at the present moment, as I understand it. There's no third party right of appeal in terms of planning.
Different matter, sorry.
Well, just let me expand on this, and you can correct me where I'm going wrong. And I think that's part of the problem with the planning process. But if we raise expectation and engagement with young people, with citizens, surely when a planning decision is made, for instance, a recent example in a local authority where, despite the serious objections by planning officials, local development was approved by elected members. which completely dumbstruck the community in that area, because they felt the planning officials are saying definitely no, the elected members say yes. So how do we get the engagement of individuals when they see the planning process and the vagaries of the planning process that can be overturned by the whims of elected members against the advice and recommendations of the planning officials and others to the decisions?
Scenario that happens on a daily basis, often the other way around as well. Mr Holder.
I'm suggesting you refer to the decisions of politicians as whims, but at the end of the day, these are the elected representatives of the people. So they will make decisions based on the information given to them. And if it's suggesting, if this is what's being suggested, I would strongly disagree that you essentially have an appeal process by objectors to decisions taken by any objector to any decision. I think that would just bring the system almost to a complete halt.
I should have said I was quoting constituents when I said the whims of the planning decisions.
But that's actually the nub of the matter, is that the planning system is highly political. You know, we have a local planning authority, so you have a local government that is also the planning authority. You will have different views, you will have different values, and they're all brought out through the planning system. You know, somebody wants something here, somebody else has a different view. And then it's up to the officer, who are highly experienced professional people, to make their considered recommendation. And of course, it is then the elected members who ratifies. Well, we have now obviously delegated power, which can help a little bit in that respect. But we have in some areas local review bodies where you have a decision being taken and then it's being appealed against again. So it actually, to some extent, further politicised the planning system.
And McTaggart, please.
Convener, well, I've got a few questions, but I'll home in on the statutory force. What do the panel feel whether the SPS should have a statutory force or not? Your views on that?
Any views on that, Mr Holder?
In my view, it should. It is, as someone referred to earlier this morning, the main points of policy to which all decision makers refer. As we discussed, NPF is more about where, but how is critically important, and therefore I think that that's something that the Scottish Government should and Parliament should oversee.
Convener, I would agree with the points that Robin has raised. Certainly, I think there's merit in more seriously looking at a national plan where the where and the how is linked with the policy. But I think that's more 4 years down the line, looking at the next stage and looking at it as an evolution, because this stage has made a big step. But I think it actually can bring more clarity if it was a statutory, a much stronger statutory requirement to take account of the SPP policies.
Thank you, Convener. I would agree. I think it's an anomaly, and we're going back to explaining things to the public. If you look at the Planning Act, the SPP isn't mentioned. The Scottish Government isn't given a specific power to issue policy. That policy isn't mentioned in the Act. So if you're a member of the public, the first thing you might think is to go and look at the Act. So I think it is an anomaly that NPF 3 that we're talking about today does have statutory force. The SPP isn't mentioned.
Ms Beaverbach.
I didn't actually comment on this, but I would say anything that helps to make the system more efficient, to give greater transparency and for the public to have a better understanding has to be welcomed.
Anne?
Yeah, and I think you've kind of answered my next question. It's about the culture change, whether the SPPP and the MPF will assist in planning culture change.
Start with Ms Beaverbach this time.
Okay, well, first of all, we would welcome the MPF 3, the way it was presented from a public's point of view. It was easily readable. I think this time round the Scottish Government did a lot more in terms of going out to the public, going out to the uninitiated, and that has to be welcomed. So I think, as Pam said, we're on a journey here, we're on an evolution, and I think the planning system in Scotland, with some of the provisos that I made earlier on, could become even more inclusive and more robust. And at the end of the day, the more upfront engagement we have, the less cost there is at the end. Because it is very, very costly if we're having to fight through courts and so on, any kind of application that went wrong. So the more we can get consensus built right from the start, the better.
Mr. Collar?
I don't think there's anything I can usefully add, really.
Does anyone else want to add anything there? Ms. Ewan?
I would just add that for me, in terms of culture change, one of the biggest shifts that I've seen through MPF3 has been outcomes focus. And that I think that's taking Scottish Government as wider terms and the focus on outcomes and links to the Christie Commission. And certainly in TAPLAN, we have done a lot of work, and we're just about to go out for our main issues report stage. We've done a lot of work looking at our outcomes, and that's with other public sector agencies. So it's about working in collaboration and working to the same outcomes and how they fit with the national outcomes. So I think that's a big shift and a cultural shift, which I think will take time to drill through the whole development plan, but that's something I've certainly welcomed. Very clear shift in MPF3.
Just add, I think culture change is the fundamental issue, because it is the implementation of Scottish planning policy in MPF3, mostly by local authorities, that is the key here to delivering sustainable economic growth. And the biggest hurdle to that, in my opinion, is the speed at which development plans are prepared, because it is something, I think, that is relatively straightforward. It's a plan showing where things are going to be, which you consult upon. And if they're up to date, you don't have confusing situations of developers coming in with lots of appeals and people wondering why this appeal doesn't fit with that plan, North Lanarkshire maybe being the example. Because working with developers a lot, if there's an up-to-date plan and it doesn't include your site, you won't get appeals because they will not succeed with them. So critically, up-to-date plans are needed. And just as a statistic that you might want to be aware of, since the Planning Act was passed in 2006, there have been only 4 local development plans approved under the new Act. Now, there'll be more coming through the system over the next year, but that's a lamentable pace at which to move at, and may well explain the appeal that was referred to earlier, because the Glasgow and Clyde Valley SDP has been approved, but the LDP that sits beneath it is lagging behind, and it may well be that the developer sees a difference between those two documents and is exploiting it, or perhaps quite rightly making a proposal that sits with the more recent plan but not the later plan. But it's this disjunction between plans which causes a huge amount of confusion.
Thank you. Really just to say, I think the culture change, thanks for those suggestions, but I'm really enthralled at the one about encouraging the schools and the education system to become more involved. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Going back to the community councils, and I've been to many community council meetings, I'm not sure that they should be totally empowered because they tend to delay everything. They come to masses and masses of different conclusions, and it just will delay, I think, the process. When people speak about planning, I think they also speak about housing. That's what they mostly mean, and therefore it's houses. I wonder if we should really empower the community councils, some of which work well, some of which don't, I mean, they can comment, I think, but I don't think they should be. They have the powers to actually veto it or change it or appeal. I just wonder what you thought.
Well, I would have to disagree with you there. Yeah. And the reason I disagree with you, because under the current system, the community council makeup attracts exactly the kind of people that you are now describing, which are, in a way, the guardian of, they see themselves as the guardian of the status quo. They don't necessarily want to see change. We have an average age of community councils who are well in their 60s, who are white, who are, you could make all the assumptions, who are not necessarily representative.
Can I interrupt you, sorry? Somebody has got an electronic device on. I did say at the very start of the meeting that all of them should be switched off. They do muck up the sound quite badly. We have an obligation to make sure that the throngs that are watching this at home on the internet can hear what we're saying. Sorry, Miss Beaverbath, for that interruption.
That's fine. Just to reiterate, I would say that at the moment there is a self-selection process going on within community councils. It attracts the kind of people that want to maintain the status quo. What we would like to see, I think what we should be arguing is, however, a more robust, a more inclusive community councils, like they have on the continent, like they have, for example, in the Scandinavian countries, and really empower them, resource them properly, but also make them responsible as well. So that we see, for example, the Young Placemakers Initiative is trying to get more younger people involved in community councils so that they're reflecting to some extent the attitudes and the awareness and the desire of young people to see what happens into their areas. And that is, I think, one way forward. So I agree, your current experience is absolutely right, but doesn't mean to say that we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think as a structure, it's absolutely perfect. We just haven't used it enough.
Yeah, I think Mr. Holder... no, I read you wrong there. Okay, Mr. Buchanan.
Thank you. Sorry, I just wanted to say, I think making them responsible is definitely laudable. It's also about information. We're not informing them and keeping them informed about what's happening in advance. So they come to these community council meetings faced with a sort of a sheet of paper that they've got to read quickly. And I just wonder if that's, you know, because it depends on the community council, but some of them are not very active. And as you say, they're all, I think it just depends on them.
Yes. The practicality of a community council working is like this. They're volunteers in the first instance. They are working often on a 6-weekly cycle in terms of meeting. They often have one planning convener that gets all the information from local authorities, and there's huge amounts of information given out. And then they have to cope with all of that and make decisions. So it is, and of course they're supposed to then also involve the general public because they are supposed to be representative on a shoestring budget. And you're right, and Robin's experience is absolutely correct, and we have worked with thousands of community councils over the years. There is a real disconnect between what community councils could be and what they are at the moment in time. They're not fulfilling their proper function.
Okay, Richard Baker, please.
Just one question. It's really much a matter of practicality as policy, and that is in the previous evidence session I asked the Minister if he was confident that local authority planning departments were adequately resourced to implement effectively local and national planning strategy. Now, the Minister was confident generally that this was the case. Now, given that you'll all have good experience of potential local variation in this, I just wondered if that's something you would agree with.
Mr. Holder?
I'm a user of the system as a planning consultant, and my experience is that it is hugely varied. It depends very much on the decisions of individual councils as to how they focus their resources. I think there was a suggestion by the Minister that increasing planning fees would have benefits in terms of improvements to service. I've, in my experience, got no evidence of that whatsoever. And my worry is actually that the increase in planning fees is simply falls into the funds of the whole council and the way that they deal with things. And my worry is, and it's related to your question, is that there is no way that I've seen so far to incentivise decision makers to do things quickly and efficiently. There are no sticks, there are no carrots, because simply increasing fees may mean more money for the council, but it doesn't have any, unless I'm misunderstanding, any particular requirement or link to improvements in service. Gian?
I think it's quite a difficult question, because I think right across, my experience is right across local government, you know, there is generally less resource to do what one has done in the past. So we have to work smarter and we have to work more efficient. TAPLAN has a team of 3, myself and 2 other planners, and sometimes we call in additional resources, but we deliver, and we deliver on time, and we've won awards for that work. So I think you just have to look at the resources you have, like any business, like any organisation, and deliver to the best of your abilities for that. Of course, there's balances. We've talked a lot in this session about consultation and the need to get out. That is a balance. It's a resource balance with what you can do with consultation. If you look at the size of the TAPLAN area, it's huge. So I have to look at the resources we've got, how best we think we can get out to people to engage them and enthuse them to come in with their comments. So it's always a balance. I think the question that you'd asked for the written submissions was around a reduction in staff resources, and I can't comment whether that actually has been the case or the extent to that. But I don't think it's about just the numbers. It's about, I've used consultation, but it's also about the application process and the amount of work that resource has to do. So the additional work that's come in planning authorities with the resource they have. So it's not just about the numbers, it's about the work that they have to do and how that's changed over time. But for any organisation and any business, it's being flexible with your resource and responding to that with your own needs.
Bowler?
Nothing really to add to the previous two speakers.
Ms Bieberbach?
Very quickly, just obviously in 2008 we had an economic crisis. We have seen through this crisis, I think there has been a huge reduction in personnel in the planning departments. Nevertheless, they've still coped with the same amount and increasing amount of work. We've certainly seen a huge increase in volunteering activity for planning aid, partly because the planner want to keep their experience up to date. In terms of resourcing, we need to look at it in the wider sense in terms of public sector reform. And what we're welcoming now is the sort of alignment between other public sector services such as community planning and land use planning. And so maybe resourcing can be looked at in a slightly different way.
McMillan, please.
Thank you, Convener. It's a question to Mr Holder. In your submission, you state that I am strongly of the view that NPF 3 should contain regional housing targets. Can you give me a bit more information on that, please, as to why you think that?
Yeah, the current system, if you like, is that strategic development plans based on the content of what's quite a complex exercise of housing need and demand assessment incorporates, if you like, the regional housing target. Now that's SDP, and there are different SDPs. Some have been better than others in terms of both speed and content. But in my view, there is no particular reason why that cannot be addressed in the National Planning Framework. And in my view, and this may not be something that Pam would support at all, I actually doubt the need for strategic development plans, which are an extra layer in the system which delay the production of the detailed plan, in my view. I'm not saying that regional planning is not something we need to do. It absolutely is. But I do question the statutory need for a strategic development plan, which in my experience does not deliver enough added value to justify its existence. Now, what I have seen in my experience is that the battleground of the strategic development plan are the housing numbers, because that is what feeds into the local plan allocation of housing sites. And in the case of CESPLAN, the recently approved plan, that was a battleground indeed, and wasted a lot of time and energy of the government, developers and the 6 councils involved in that. And it was all over the housing requirement and what that should be. In my view, I believe that the government should establish, Parliament should establish housing requirements on a regional basis which are indicated in MPF. And it takes away, at a lower level, a whole load of arguments. I'm not saying it doesn't put more emphasis on your responsibilities, but I think it's a responsibility that rests with the Scottish Parliament. And I'm afraid there are some council areas who do not wish to provide to meet full housing need, and will present plans which do not comply with Scottish planning policy. Now that is usually resolved eventually in big examination and appeals and lots of arguments. But I think we could have a much simpler system if actually SDPs, in a statutory sense, were removed from the system and MPF took over some of those responsibilities, or indeed a national plan.
Gia?
Well, you won't be surprised to know that I don't agree with Robin, and certainly a lot of that. Just on SDPs, I don't want to get into that in detail. I think the Minister already set out that the government have a current consultants looking at an strategic development plan review in terms of their process and content, and I hope a positive report will come to Scottish Government in end of February, March in that regard. My understanding and overview of development planning in Scotland, and I touched on before, I've done work in the past few years in Wales and Ireland. Wales, as I understand, are proposing to implement a very similar planning system to we have in Scotland. There is a lot, and England are now jealous of what we have in Scotland because they did away with strategic planning, and I believe in it's largely in quite a mess in how that is coming through. So it's for those reasons that I think that we have a good, solid development planning system with it at the national level, the city region level, where that's appropriate, and the local level. On housing targets, I actually think this issue is about how well a strategic development plan deals with housing, rather than whether it should be at a national level. Certainly the Tay Plan Authority believe that's a local decision, not a Scottish Government decision, and that's for our local politicians to make the decisions about identifying the amount of housing and then allocating that. I think Scottish planning policy, we have to see what comes out in the finalised national policy, but certainly that raised questions which I think gets to the crux of it, and it does get quite technical, but it's at what level does a strategic development plan allocate? Some may allocate just at an overall strategic development plan level. Certainly in Tay Plan, we drill right down. And where we have to make cross-council boundary decisions, then that's set out in the plan. And I think it's important for investors and consultants and developers and for communities to have the clarity through the plans, because that's what it's about. I think a lot of people do look at plans and think about housing. One of my ambitions is to get them to think wider, because it's about climate adaptation, longer term. It's not just about housing. So certainly I'm very firmly of the view that it's not for Scottish Government to set national targets. There's a lot of technical work, well actually a lot of local knowledge goes into identifying that need and demand. But I think Scottish planning policy could do more in getting a more consistent approach across Scotland and how that's actually taken forward.
Thank you, Convener. I know today we were really focusing a little bit more on the process rather than the content of the NPF, but I would agree with Mr Holder that it's noticeable within the NPF there is not much said about delivering housing, and I would endorse the point he's making, which I think I would sum up as the plan-led system. There's a few substantial examples where that's failed to deliver the housing land supply to address the housing need. I take the point about, as the Minister mentioned, there's a study ongoing, but from what I've heard so far, that's a study into the strategic development plans and their value at a general level. And I think there is a need for more detailed scrutiny about how they are addressing housing in particular, because, as Mr Holder said, it is a very difficult issue that the whole of the system has to grapple with. And in some areas it's sucked up a lot of time and a lot of energy and caused no end of problems.
Beaverbach? Okay, thank you.
Obviously, another committee in the Parliament has the remit and focus on housing as compared to ours, but there is an argument that could certainly that could be put forward that if housing were to be considered in the NPF3, as you suggest, Mr Holder, then the government could be accused of actually trying to centralise more powers and take more powers away from local authorities and local decision makers. Certainly the government don't actually have that agenda. It's about empowering more local authorities and empowering local communities so they can take more decisions for themselves.
Thanks, Convener. Can I put it another way? Currently, the Council's worked with the Scottish Government on establishing that number through the Housing Need and Demand Assessment. It's a very technical exercise, actually. There's not a great deal of discretion, if you like, as to what it's going to be. This is about the big number, and then it's about the local plans which decide where this is going to go, which for me, crucially, is about local community involvement and what happens. The actual number, I think, is much more of a technical assessment, and I think it gets confused in the political domain of the strategic development plan, actually. Because at the end of the day, what happened with the South East Scotland plan was that they did a housing need and demand assessment at that level. Government policy says that you should meet that and allocate enough land to achieve it. And the Cess Plan Authority decided that they weren't going to do that. And then a reporter came along and said, I'm sorry, that doesn't comply with Scottish planning policy, do it. That was a complete waste of time, because it was clear to all the observers, including me, that if you weren't in compliance with Scottish planning policy, it was going to be changed. But that didn't stop a political influence delaying a plan by 2 or 3 years. So maybe sometimes the government does need to step up to the plate and take charge.
Okay, that's some interesting points. Okay, I've got another question, if it's okay, Convener. Just
McMillan, because
sure,
we've got others to come in.
Sure, just it's regarding the issue of community planning. It's Mr Holder as well in your submission. It's the bottom of page 3 that you suggest that, but I do not get the impression of a successful connection between land use planning and community planning. The issue of, also, there's been quite a number of discussions today regarding the issue of community planning, and it's something that this committee has certainly looked at with previous work as well. If this is as you suggest, then surely that should be an issue for local authorities to really improve upon what they are doing, to really have that empowerment with the people who stay in their areas, as compared to potentially some type of diktat
I did say briefly
from the top down.
Mr. Holder.
I'll probably suggest actually the question's better addressed to the council heads of planning, who I think you're seeing in another session. I just agree with what you're saying. I think it relates to how how councils deal with their communities.
Okay, thank you.
McDonald, please.
Thank you, Convener. Part of what I was going to ask was addressed there in that last question from Stuart McMillan, so my question will be directed to Ms Beaverbach. I should declare an interest at the beginning, Convener, as my wife is a member of a community council, although I do take the point that Ms Beaverbach was making, and that she's the youngest on that community council by a good 20 years. But in terms of community involvement, which I know Planning Aid Scotland majors on quite heavily in its submission, as distinct from perhaps community council involvement, how does Ms Beaverbach see that being brought into the planning system in a different kind of way?
Sorry, I just want to be clear that I understand the question. Are you saying community council and community planning?
Well, no, you make a number of points in your submission around the need to involve communities more, and there is reference to community planning, but there's also reference to community involvement, which I don't think are necessarily always the exact same thing. And I just wondered how you see more community involvement being encouraged in the planning system, rather than simply the same faces who tend to appear at community councils and indeed community planning partnerships.
Yes. I think it links to the previous point about community planning and the alignment with spatial planning. So we have at the moment a system in Scotland where we have public service delivery all decided through the community planning process. And alongside we have spatial planning, which is sort of sits in a different orbit altogether. What we're finding is you have community planning partnerships who never know about community councils, who never know about that there's such a thing as the planning system. So the spatial expression is left out when you plan your public service delivery. We're now seeing public sector reform, which is very good with the 4 Ps, preventative spend, partnership, place and people. So we're moving to a more place agenda, which is welcome, because that can, for the first time, link much more cohesively the community planning, which is about, well, it's supposed to be about community and it's supposed to be about forward planning, but I think it's neither at the moment. But it can be and it should be. And what we're trying to do in our work, working with local communities through the Charette Plus model, to actually really from the bottom up, working with local communities and explain how the system around planning works, the engagement, but also working with the community planning team in local authorities so that we can start bringing these two together. Again, I said earlier, the role of community councils is a crucial one, but it's not at the moment properly resourced. I think it should also be extended in terms of looking at having a statutory role in the community development plan process, which at the moment they don't have. So it's all very reactive. And I think if the role of the community council can be enhanced properly, then actually they become representatives of their local communities. And that's what we want to aim for. So we're doing a lot of work with community councils because we do firmly believe that they have an absolute crucial role in the planning process, but it's a long way to go.
I wanted to ask about the charrette process, and this one I can maybe throw open to other witnesses to answer as well. In my constituency, there has been a charrette for the Grand Home development in Aberdeen, and that had a huge amount of community involvement. One of the difficulties, though, is that we still have, in many respects, planners, local councillors who are stuck in the old way of doing planning, and so that doesn't necessarily transplant itself to the charrette process, or indeed to communicating the benefits of the charrette process to the public and things like that. So how can we bridge that gap between putting in place the charrette process, which I think is a very good way to do things, and getting the message communicated to the public via people who maybe still think of things before the charrette process was brought in?
Just for those people who have not heard, and charrette is a French terminology, but what it actually does, it's a vision statement basically that's articulated by the local population, that's articulated from the bottom up and saying, working with the architects, working with the planners to draw up a visual statement. And it's very powerful, I think, for the community, because for the first time they can come together, they can air their views, but they can also see their views and ideas visualized. And then what we have done with the Charrette Plus process, which we're hoping to work with PALM on, is actually to then translate that into bring in the community planning team as well, so that you can actually harness some of the ideas and energy that is in local communities, to then say for local communities, well, we can take that on, we can do this actually. These are our ideas, but we can. So if you bring more cross-sectorial working, then it's actually very, very helpful to really realise visions. And so the traditional charrette process has just been between the built environment professionals. What we're now trying to do is linking it to other services in local government.
Okay. Mr. Poller?
I think I'll pass. I don't have any direct experience of the charrette, so...
Ms. Ewan?
Well, as Petra touched on, we're looking more at the charrette plus model to widen that, and I think charrette is just a term that is used, and whether it's called a charrette or not a charrette, whatever a planning authority badge their engagement exercise, I think it's just the essence of that. But coming back to a few kind of key points is that has to be balanced with the resources you've got, and Robin's point earlier about not taking too long to consult. So there is a balance there. I could spend 12 months going around T-Plan and speak to thousands of people and get a lot more engagement. But that's not what's wanted in the planning system. So it is that balance of your time and your resources against engagement and consultation. And it'll be a different judgment in different areas.
I endorse that. And I've been involved in a few charrettes, and they're tremendously effective, because someone used the word translation. I think it was you, Petra, translating the jargon into practical discussion about what it all means. But you can only do that with 20, 30, 40, 50 people at the same time. Can you do that 10, 20, 30 times over in a community? Not really. So I take your point.
So your view would be that we need to look at ways that planning is done with people rather than to people.
And the term consultation is actually something, when you have already done something, you're then going out to communities. What you want is flip this round and say, okay, what would you like? So that is a proper participation process. And, you're engaging the community, and you engage and harness their own vision. And that's much more powerful. I should just add at this moment, if I may, Convener, just one point, and that is, it is really left to individual local planning authorities how much they want to spend on engagement. And we'll see, and there is no dedicated budget. It can be come out of all sorts of, can be made up of all sorts of things. And maybe that's something this committee wants to look into in a bit more detail in order to get a more efficient and a more inclusive planning system. Should we look into how much local authorities actually spend on engaging the general public?
It's not up to us to dictate to local authorities how they budget, Ms Bieberbach. That's a matter for them. However, we always look for best practice and try and export that where that is at all possible. Can I thank you very much for your evidence today? I now suspend for till 11:40. We now move on to agenda item 2, which is to consider petition PE 1469 by Aileen Jackson, calling on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to consider changing planning regulations to enable an increase in the current neighbour notification distance of 20 metres in relation to wind turbine planning applications. Members, I'm looking to you for action. Mr Baker.
I just think want to raise, Convener, I think that this petition raises very valid concerns, but I do also note that the Scottish Government has said that they do intend to produce more guidance on wind turbine proposal development, and I do hope the Scottish Government takes on board some of the points which have been made in this petition, but I think obviously we'll be able to engage in more informed deliberation on the petition, or the Petitions Committee will, once that new guidance has been published. I think that would be very helpful for making any final decisions.
Any other comments? Can we agree to note the petition at this moment in time? Thank you. I now suspend the meeting and we move into private session.